The scent of rosemary ham was still drifting through the dining room when Dad rose from his chair, the carving knife glinting in his hand like a warning. The fire crackled behind him, Christmas lights blinking softly along the mantel, but the warmth in the room vanished the moment he cleared his throat. "Before we open gifts," he said, voice steadier than the trembling in his knuckles, "I have an announcement to make." The table fell silent. Bryce stopped bragging mid-sentence, fork frozen in the air. Tessa lowered her phone. Mom set down the serving spoon so quietly it barely touched the tablecloth. I felt the shift, that heavy familiar tension that always came right before the Mercers burned another holiday to the ground. Dad inhaled sharply. "I've sold Mercer Millworks," he said. "The deal is finalized. $50 million. Bryce jerked upright like someone had yanked a string in his spine. Tessa gasped. Mom's hands flew to her mouth. I sat still, fingertips barely touching the stem of my wine glass. I'd been waiting a long time for this moment, longer than anyone here knew. Bryce sputtered, "Dad, you what?" Tessa slapped both palms on the table. "To who? Why didn't you tell us?" Dad lifted his chin with that domineering pride he'd carried for as long as I'd known him. "Summit Enterprises," he declared. "A reputable private equity firm. They'll take good care of our legacy." Bryce nodded quickly, desperate to regain footing. "Well, at least it's a big player. Maybe we'll still get our inheritance." I let the corner of my mouth lift only slightly. "Dad," I said quietly, "who signed the contract?" He looked at me, confused I'd even spoken. "Summit Enterprises," he repeated. I couldn't stop the soft laugh that escaped. "Dad, I own Summit Enterprises." And in an instant, the entire Mercer family froze. No one breathing, no one speaking, the Christmas lights blinking across faces pale with disbelief. Mom blinked first, eyes darting from me to Dad as though she'd misheard everything. Bryce's mouth opened and closed, like he'd lost the ability to form words. Tessa leaned back so hard her chair creaked. Dad grasped the table, edge knuckles white. "What did you just say?" he murmured. I didn't need to answer. The truth hung in the air like a spark ready to ignite. I'd been quiet my entire life, silent through every slight, every dismissal, every assumption that I was the least capable Mercer at this table. Tonight, silence wasn't my ally, truth was. But before any of them could speak, the tension in the room snapped back into its old formation. Bryce pointed at me with a shaky hand. "Dad, don't listen to her. She doesn't know anything about the family business." Tessa chimed in, her voice rising in pitch. "Exactly. She left Bend. She hasn't been part of Mercer Millworks in years." Their panic was almost nostalgic, a return to the Mercer family's favorite sport, erasing me before I even had space to stand. I took in the scene, Dad gripping his knife like a gavel, Bryce sweating, Tessa trembling, Mom trying to appear composed while her eyes betrayed her. I hadn't planned to reveal anything tonight. I only came home to sit through another holiday where I'd be spoken over like a decorative chair. But when Dad announced the sale, when I heard the number $50 million fall from his lips like a victory he never expected, that changed everything. I set my napkin on my lap, feeling the familiar texture of the linen grounding myself. "Dad," I said, voice calm, "Summit Enterprises didn't approach you out of the blue." He frowned. "What are you talking about?" Bryce scoffed loudly. "Oh, please, Hannah. Don't pretend you were involved in any of this." Tessa nodded eagerly. "Dad, she's just trying to make herself look important." I looked at them both and felt a strange, unexpected sympathy. They didn't understand. They'd never understood. Mom finally spoke. "Hannah, sweetheart, what do you mean you own Summit Enterprises?" Her voice shook. It wasn't suspicion. It was something closer to fear. Fear that she'd always known I had built something bigger than any of them imagined. I turned my gaze to her for a brief moment. "Mom, the question isn't whether I own Summit Enterprises. The question is why Dad didn't ask who was behind it." Dad stiffened. "Why would I? Summit is a firm, not some." His words died. I saw it, the first flicker of dread. The first glimmer of recognition that the world might not be what he thought it was. Bryce, failing to regain control, slammed his palm onto the table. The silverware jumped. "Enough, Hannah, stop acting like you have some role here. Dad and I run the business. You don't even live here anymore." His voice carried the entitlement he wore like cologne, strong enough to choke the room. I lifted my chin. "You're right, Bryce. I don't live here anymore. But that doesn't mean I disappeared." Tessa narrowed her eyes. "Then why come back tonight? Why now?" I held her stare, and for the first time she looked away first. Because I said softly, I knew tonight was the night everything would change. Mom's face paled. She knew the truth all along. She knew I wasn't the girl who left Bend years ago, with nothing but a duffel bag and a heart full of bruises. She knew I'd built something in Seattle, something powerful, something real. I folded my hands steady as stone. "You all deserve to know what's been happening," I said, "but I won't argue across a table full of food." I rose from my chair. "Dad, can we step aside? There are things you should hear without an audience." Bryce barked a laugh. "There's nothing she can say that matters." I met his eyes. "Then you won't mind listening." Dad pushed back his chair slowly. He didn't look confident or angry or proud. He looked confused and maybe for the first time afraid he didn't understand his own daughter. Mom quickly stood and touched his arm. "Greg, maybe we should hear her out." But before he could respond, I added quietly, "One more thing." All three of them stared, waiting, breath held. "Mercer Millworks wasn't sold because it was thriving," I said. "It was sold because it was dying." Silence hit harder than any shout. Tessa's lip quivered. Bryce's jaw twitched. Dad's posture faltered. "I wasn't here to hurt them. I wasn't here to take revenge. I was here because Mercer Millworks deserved better than mismanagement and denial. And because the truth, my truth, could no longer stay buried under Christmas lights and family pride." Dad finally nodded, the smallest nod but enough to shift the ground beneath us. "Fine," he said quietly. "Let's talk." And as we stepped away from the table, I knew this Christmas dinner was no longer about turkey gifts or tradition. It was about legacy truth. And the night the quiet daughter they underestimated finally took her place at the center of the story. When the dining room door closed behind Dad and me, the murmurs from the table dimmed into a muffled hum like distant static. I could still feel the weight of their stares pressed against my back. Bryce's indignation, Tessa's panic, Mom's trembling worry. But as soon as the hallway swallowed us, another memory stepped into their place, one I'd tried to bury for years. The last night I ever tried to belong in this family. I was 24 the night Dad told me I wasn't cut out for real business. The words came back with such clarity, it felt like he'd whispered them behind me. We were standing in this same hallway. I'd just asked if I could shadow him at Mercer Millworks for a week, hoping to learn something, anything that would make me feel less like an outsider in my own family. He'd laughed, patted my shoulder, and said, "Quiet girls don't lead companies, Hannah. Let your siblings handle the business. You're better off with an office job." I remember nodding, pretending it didn't burn. But it did. It burned so deeply it shaped the person I became. Dad faced me now, older lines etched deeper around his eyes. "What's going on, Hannah?" he asked. "What are you trying to say?" But before I could answer, another door creaked open behind us. Mom stepped into the hallway, her face pale, her voice low. "Greg, let her talk." Those words hit me harder than anything Dad had said at dinner, because years ago she hadn't said a word. She'd stood behind Dad silent while he shut every door I tried to open. But now she was standing beside me. A small shift, but a seismic one. "Dad," I began, choosing each word carefully. "You asked who I think I am. To answer that, you need to understand who I was before I left Bend." He frowned as if I'd spoken in another language. I couldn't blame him. He'd never cared enough to see beyond the role he'd assigned me. "I didn't leave because I hated this family," I continued. "I left because I finally realized I could work my entire life to prove myself, and it still wouldn't be enough. Dad opened his mouth, but I lifted a hand. He stopped. Even that surprised him. When I was a kid, I said all I ever wanted was to be part of Mercer Millworks. I used to sit in that office. I pointed toward the door behind him and imagine myself helping you build something lasting. Memories spilled in before I could stop them. Bryce getting a miniature hard hat for Christmas, Tessa getting a designer sketchbook, and me receiving a hand-me-down calculator Dad didn't remember giving me the year before. He'd smiled and said, "Useful, right?" I'd held it like a treasure. I was 9. I wanted to learn, I whispered. I really did. But every time I tried, Bryce laughed. Tessa rolled her eyes. And you? I swallowed. You told me leadership wasn't in me. Dad's jaw flexed. I never meant. You didn't have to mean it. I heard it. Behind him, Mom's breath caught. I didn't look at her because if I did, my voice might crack and I needed it steady. Years of being talked over at this dinner table, ignored at family meetings, dismissed in ways too small to scream but too sharp to forget, they all landed between us. I left Bend, I said, because I knew if I stayed, I'd never find out who I could be on my own terms. Dad's shoulders dropped an inch. Not enough to signal surrender, but enough to show he was listening. When I moved to Seattle, I was scared, I admitted. I didn't have a plan. I didn't have money. I didn't have connections. All I had was the certainty that staying here meant becoming invisible forever. It was the truth, raw and unvarnished. The version of my life no one in that dining room had ever bothered to ask about. I drew a breath. I started small, really small. Entry-level finance. Long hours. A roommate who ate my groceries. A car that died every winter. I let out a soft, humorless laugh. I walked to work in the rain so many times I thought my shoes might dissolve. Dad's frown deepened. Maybe he was picturing the daughter he barely knew, trudging through cold Seattle mornings, trying to build a life far away from the family she still wanted to belong to. But I kept going, I said, because every time I felt like quitting, I heard your voice saying I wasn't made for big things, and I refused to let you be right. Mom stepped closer, hands clasped at her waist. Hannah, she whispered, why didn't you tell us how hard it was for you? I turned to her, my chest tightening. Because whenever I tried to talk about work, you two changed the subject to Bryce or Tessa. I didn't fit in your version of this family anymore. The hallway swallowed the silence that followed. It wasn't angry silence. It was the sound of truths too heavy to ignore. Do you remember, I asked Dad, when I applied for that administrative position at the mill, the one I worked up the courage to ask for? He nodded stiffly. You told me you didn't want to complicate things and suggested I find something less demanding. Dad's gaze shifted downward, shame creeping over him. I wanted to be part of this family's legacy, I said, but every time I reached for it, the door shut in my face. Mom pressed a trembling hand to her chest. We didn't know, she said softly. Hannah, we truly didn't know. My throat tightened. You didn't look, I said gently. That's not the same. Dad ran a hand down his face, suddenly looking older. So when you left, you weren't running away. No, I said. I was running toward something. I just didn't know what yet. Dad exhaled. Then what did you find out there? For the first time since dinner began, I felt a spark of the woman. I'd become the one who had built something powerful, something no Mercer had ever expected. I found out, I said slowly, that quiet doesn't mean small. It means focused. And strength doesn't always shout. Sometimes it whispers until it becomes undeniable. Dad blinked, unsure how to respond. Mom touched his arm. Greg, she's right. I turned toward the living room where the murmured voices of Bryce and Tessa drifted faintly through the walls. They were waiting for Dad to come back and re-establish the hierarchy, restore the Mercer order they'd always relied on. But the order was already gone. I looked back at Dad. I didn't leave because I didn't love this family, I said. I left because it was the only way to love myself. Mom covered her mouth as tears filled her eyes. And the truth is, I added, every step I took away from Bend, I took with this family still in my heart. Even when you pushed me out, I carried Mercer with me. Dad's voice broke. Then why didn't you tell us what you were becoming? Because if I told you 8 years ago that I was building something big, I said quietly, you wouldn't have believed me. You might have even laughed. Dad's breath stilled. And if I failed, I continued, I didn't want that failure tied to Mercer. I wanted it to be mine alone. A moment passed, one loaded with years of misunderstanding, buried resentment, and unspoken longing. Then Dad whispered the words I'd never imagined hearing. I'm sorry. It was barely audible, but it was real. My own breath hitched, but I steadied it. We can talk about apologies later, I said softly. Right now, you need to understand something. He lifted his eyes. I didn't vanish from your world, I said. I was building something powerful enough to change it. Dad stared at me, absorbing every word. Mom's hand pressed tighter against his arm. And somewhere behind us, I heard the faint clatter of a fork hitting a plate. Bryce or Tessa, listening, realizing, fearing. I straightened my shoulders. Let's go back, I said. They deserve to hear the truth, too. Dad nodded slowly. Mom wiped her eyes. And together, we walked back toward the dining room, toward the storm I'd been preparing to face my entire life. Seattle didn't welcome me with open arms. It greeted me with freezing rain, a drafty studio apartment, and a city skyline that made me feel smaller than I'd ever felt in Bend. But it was also the first place where no one knew I was the quiet Mercer kid, the one destined to stay in the background. Here I was, just another woman trying to make rent, taking the bus before sunrise, walking home long after the streetlights flickered on. And strange as it sounds, that anonymity felt like freedom. My first job was in a cramped finance office that smelled faintly of burnt coffee and toner. I spent my days entering numbers into spreadsheets, and my evenings studying financial modeling on a laptop older than Bryce's college textbooks. Every time exhaustion crept in, I heard Dad's voice from years ago, "Quiet girls don't run businesses." That voice became fuel, pushing me through long nights when the world outside my window blurred into cold rain and neon reflections. One morning during a company meeting I wasn't even supposed to attend, everything changed. A senior partner named Warren Hale walked into the room with the slow confidence of someone who'd seen every economic cycle since the 70s. He scanned the table, stopped when he reached me, and asked, "Who's the analyst who flagged the cost overrun risk on the Tacoma renovation?" My stomach tightened. That had been me. He nodded, once impressed. "You think differently," he said. "Come see me after this." Those words cracked something open inside me, like someone had reached into the quietest part of my soul and found value there. His office overlooked the waterfront sunlight, reflecting sharply off the water. He leaned back in his chair and folded his hands. "People assume the loudest person knows the most," he said. "They're wrong. The quiet ones pay attention." It was the first time an older man in power didn't dismiss me, didn't compare me to Bryce, didn't tell me what I supposedly couldn't do. He saw me, really saw me. Over the next months, Warren became a mentor I didn't know how much I needed. He taught me how to read financial statements like they were confession letters, how to notice the tiny red flags that meant a company was weeks away from disaster, how to negotiate without raising my voice, and how to find opportunity in places everyone else had written off. Sometimes he'd glance at me over his glasses and say, "You've got the instinct. Don't let anyone convince you otherwise." Under his guidance, I learned about private equity, not the glossy Wall Street fantasy version, but the gritty boots-on-the-ground process of evaluating struggling family businesses. I recognized them instantly, companies built by passionate founders who aged out, whose children didn't want the burden, whose employees stayed loyal even as the foundation cracked. Companies like Mercer Millworks, though I wasn't ready to admit that parallel yet, even to myself. My first deal came when I was 26. A local furniture company in Spokane was collapsing under the son who'd inherited it out of obligation, not skill. I analyzed their operations, their customer base, their supply chain, and discovered a path to recovery no one else had bothered to see. Warren handed me the reins. "Sink or swim," he said. "Let's see what you've got." I swam. Within 18 months, that company was profitable again. Their owner cried when he shook my hand, saying, "You brought life back to what my father built." Something inside me tightened when he said it, something that made me think of Dad sanding planks of wood in the garage when I was little, humming old country songs, believing no one would ever love Mercer Millworks as much as he did. My second major project was bigger, a partnership to develop a commercial medical building in Tacoma. It was the kind of deal Dad would have lectured Bryce about for hours. I handled contractor negotiations, regulatory reviews, sustainability proposals. When the ribbon cutting happened and the mayor thanked the team that made this vision possible, my name wasn't mentioned. And yet, it didn't matter. I knew what I had built. Success didn't shield me from betrayal, though. There was a deal. I spent 6 relentless months preparing a merger between 2 construction suppliers. The numbers were airtight. The contracts were lined up. It would have been my largest project yet. Then, days before signing, another firm swooped in using my exact proposal. My hands shook when I saw the announcement. When I looked deeper into the competing firm, my blood ran cold. One of the partners had once worked with Dad, someone who knew my last name, someone who likely assumed I was still the invisible Mercer girl. That night, Warren invited me to dinner. We sat in a booth at a quiet seafood restaurant, and I stared at my untouched plate, while anger churned inside me, anger sharper and colder than I had ever felt. He didn't try to soothe me. He simply said, "People will take from you as long as you let them. The question is, are you done letting them?" I stared at him, at the lines in his face carved by decades of watching people rise and fall. "Yes," I whispered. "And I meant it." "Then stop building for others," he said. "Build something that's yours. Something no one can steal." Summit Enterprises was born on a rainy night in a Seattle coffee shop, my laptop flickering as I wrote the first business plan. I chose the name because the summit was the highest point on any landscape, visible from everywhere, unreachable except through perseverance. I vowed to climb my own mountain step by step, deal by deal. Summit started small, 2 employees who believed in my vision, a shoestring budget, a rented office above a cafe where the walls smelled like espresso. But our strategy was strong. We acquired a failing cabinetry shop in Oregon, a small roofing business in Washington, and a lumber distributor in Idaho. Each time, the owners looked at me skeptically until they heard me speak. Until they saw the precision in my numbers, the steadiness in my plan. Until they realized that the quiet woman in front of them wasn't guessing, she was certain. In 4 years, Summit Enterprises grew from nothing to managing more than $300 million in assets. We built commercial properties, revitalized failing companies, and earned a reputation for rescuing family businesses from the edge. But there was one company I couldn't bring myself to touch: Mercer Millworks. Every few months, I'd look up the contracts Dad was winning or losing. I noticed when suppliers switched. I noticed when old clients drifted away. I noticed when the board vacancy stayed unfilled and rumors spread of mismanagement. I noticed everything because somewhere deep down I still cared. Then one day, an email landed in my inbox from a name I hadn't seen in years, a former employee of Mercer Millworks. The subject line simply read, "She needs you." Inside was one sentence: "The company won't survive another year." My breath caught. I hadn't spoken to him in almost a decade. He had no stake in reaching out to me, but he knew who I had become. He knew I could help. That night, as Seattle rain hammered against my windows, I opened Mercer's financials and studied them line by line. The truth was undeniable. My family's legacy was dying, and the people running it were too blind or too proud to see it. I didn't decide to acquire Mercer Millworks out of spite. I didn't do it to hurt Bryce, or humiliate Tessa, or challenge Dad's authority. I did it because someone had to save what was left. Someone had to protect the employees who had given their lives to the company. Someone had to stop the slow collapse before it was irreversible. And because whether they wanted it or not, I was still a Mercer. When I signed Summit's letter of intent, my hands didn't shake. My heart didn't pound. It wasn't revenge. It was responsibility. And as I sat in that hallway outside the dining room, listening to the faint echoes of my family, wondering who I'd become, I realized something profound. I hadn't built Summit to spite them. I'd built Summit so that one day I would finally be strong enough to walk back into this house and not disappear. Tonight was that day. The first thing I noticed when I pulled into the Mercer Millworks lot that fall morning was the silence. Not the productive early shift silence I remembered from childhood, the steady hum of saws warming up the gravel crunching under trucks, the low chatter of workers grabbing coffee before the day started. No, this silence was heavy, abandoned, like a building holding its breath. I stepped out of my rental car and took in the sight of the place that had once been Dad's pride-chipped paint on the warehouse walls, a forklift sitting lopsided with a flat tire, a stack of lumber warped from rain exposure. Mercer Millworks had always been a little rough around the edges, traditional, old-school, stubbornly handmade. But this was neglect. A man in a worn canvas jacket stepped out from the side door, wiping his hands on a rag. It took him a few seconds to recognize me. "Hannah," he asked, disbelief mixing with a bittersweet smile. It was Raymond, one of the longest-serving machinists, a man who used to sneak me peppermint candies when Dad wasn't looking. "It's been a while," I said. He sighed. "You picked a hell of a time to visit." Raymond wasn't one to gossip, but even he couldn't hide the truth. Over the next 15 minutes, he told me everything Dad hadn't said and everything Bryce had tried to hide. Orders delayed, supplies short, contracts slipping, employees quitting in waves. Customers complaining about quality issues they'd never seen from us before. "There's talk," he said quietly, glancing around as though the machines could overhear him. "Talk that the next generation isn't ready, that the company's bleeding from decisions made in offices, not on the floor." I didn't have to ask who he meant. Bryce had been managing operations for nearly a year. The damage was everywhere. I thanked Raymond and made my way across the yard, heading toward the main office. The closer I got, the more my stomach tightened. Windows streaked with dust. A shipment sitting unopened by the door. A clipboard lying in the dirt, its pages warped from last night's rain. Details Dad would have never tolerated. Inside, the place was worse. Phones ringing, unanswered paperwork stacked haphazardly, the receptionist's desk empty. Even the familiar scent of pine had thinned, replaced by something synthetic and stale. I pushed open the door to the conference room and froze. There, printed bold across a wall-mounted whiteboard, was a budget reallocation chart with Bryce's signature stamped on the bottom. Under cost savings measures, a bullet point glared at me, switched to low-grade supplier Idaho. Estimated savings 32%. Low-grade supplier. Every cell in my body tightened. That explained the warped boards, the rejected shipments, the angry clients. I took a photo of the board, then paced slowly around the room, letting my eyes scan every detail. Underneath a pile of outdated brochures, I found another document, this one marked revision. The numbers had been altered with sloppy corrections, costs, shifted liabilities hidden. And Bryce had signed those too. A sharp ache pressed behind my ribs. Summit Enterprises had rescued companies from worse situations than this, but seeing it here in the company I once begged to be part of felt different. Personal. The sound of footsteps pulled me from my thoughts. A young woman stepped into the room carrying a stack of folders. She nearly dropped them when she recognized me. "Miss Mercer, I'm so sorry, I didn't know you were visiting." I gave her a small, reassuring smile. "Just Hannah." "And you are Emily," she said. "Executive assistant. Or, I guess the only assistant left." She hesitated before lowering her voice. "A lot of people have been quitting. Why? I asked gently. Her expression tightened. Because the management team stopped listening. They keep treating problems like annoyances instead of warnings. She paused, then added, Your father doesn't see half of what's happening. People are scared to tell him the truth now. Everything goes through Bryce. The words hit like a hammer. Dad had built Mercer Millworks with his own calloused hands. He'd trusted Bryce to take over not because Bryce was ready, but because Dad couldn't imagine his legacy passing to anyone else. Even when the truth was right in front of him, he refused to see it. Do you have a few minutes to talk? I asked. Emily nodded quickly and led me to her cubicle. She pulled up emails, invoices, supply chain messages, receipts of the slow, painful unraveling happening from the inside. She wasn't vindictive. She wasn't trying to get anyone in trouble. She just didn't want the company to collapse around her. When she finished showing me everything, she whispered, I love this place, Hannah. My dad worked here before me. But if something doesn't change soon, there won't be a place to save. I thanked her, leaving her with the assurance that things wouldn't stay this way, not if I had anything to do with it. As I walked toward Dad's old office, the one he'd spent half his life in, I hesitated before touching the doorknob. I expected to find the familiar space of my childhood, Dad's navy mug, his wall of framed projects, the smell of cedar. Instead, the office felt abandoned. Like someone had tried to rearrange it and then stopped halfway through. Photo frames overturned, papers half-filed, dust clinging to the corners. On the desk sat an unlocked laptop. I shouldn't have looked. But I did. A spreadsheet filled the screen, one Dad had probably never seen. Cash flow projections, overdue invoices, and a brutally clear red ink note at the bottom, projected exhaustion of operating funds, 3 months. My breath caught. 3 months. Mercer Millworks was 3 months from shutting down. I sank into Dad's chair, overwhelmed by the reality of it. All those years I'd dreamed of earning a place here, only to find the place itself crumbling. A knock interrupted the spiral. Mom stood in the doorway, her face etched with something deeper than worry. She closed the door behind her quietly. I thought you might be here, she said gently, brushing dust from an old photo frame. Your father used to say this office kept him honest. My throat tightened. Mom, did you know how bad things were? She lowered herself into the chair opposite me. I knew they weren't good, but your father has always been stubborn. He believed Bryce would grow into the role. She sighed. I wanted to tell him the truth, but he hears criticism of Bryce as betrayal. I stared at her. And me, what does he hear when I speak? Mom's eyes glistened. He hears the daughter he underestimated. And that terrifies him more than losing the company. A heavy silence settled between us. Why didn't anyone stop this? I asked. Why didn't someone tell him he was handing the company over to someone who wasn't ready? Mom looked at me with a sadness I'd never seen before. Because your father stopped listening a long time ago. He trusted the wrong child and doubted the one who could have saved him. Her voice broke on the last word. I took a slow breath, my chest tight. Mom, Mercer Millworks won't survive another year if this continues. I know, she whispered. And Dad doesn't know he sold a dyeing company. I know, she whispered again. She reached into her purse and placed a folded piece of paper on the desk. Hannah, before things get worse, and they will, you need to understand the whole picture. Her voice wavered. There are things your father won't tell you, things he's afraid to face. I unfolded the paper. It wasn't a letter. It was a list. A list of names. Employees who had already resigned. Trusted workers. People who'd been here since before I was born. My pulse hammered. Mom, I breathed. This is worse than I thought. She nodded. This family won't survive unless someone steps up. I knew exactly what she meant. And I knew exactly who she meant. As I sat in Dad's crumbling office, surrounded by the remains of the company that built our name, one truth hit me with the force of a collapsing beam. If I didn't act soon, there wouldn't be a company left for anyone to fight over on Christmas night. And maybe, just maybe, That was the moment Summit Enterprises quietly stepped into the Mercer world, not as a stranger but as the only hope left. Mom didn't say a word as she led me down the hallway, her hand gripping the banister the same way she had the night I left this house for good. The Christmas lights glowing along the staircase cast soft reflections on her face, and for the first time since I'd arrived, she looked older than I remembered. Tired, worn by years of holding together a family that didn't want to look at its own fractures. She stopped in front of Dad's old study and pushed open the door. The air smelled like dust and cedar, familiar but wrong. This room had once been Dad's sanctum, the place where I'd hovered in the doorway, as a kid praying he'd let me sit beside him and learn something. Most times he shooed me away saying he needed focus, but I always lingered just long enough to catch a glimpse of invoices, tools, sketches, fragments of a world he believed I didn't belong to. Tonight the room felt like a time capsule cracked open. Mom crossed to the built-in cabinet and knelt down, pulling out a wooden box I hadn't seen in years. Mercer Millworks was engraved into the lid with the original company logo, the tall Douglas fir, and the dated serif lettering Dad had carved himself back when the business was just a dream and a beat-up truck. She placed the box on the desk with a reverence I didn't understand. "I should have shown you this years ago," she whispered. "But I didn't know how." My chest tightened. "Mom, what is that?" She didn't answer. She opened the lid. The hinges creaked like an old memory waking up. Inside, nestled among brittle papers and cloth-bound ledgers, was a stack of documents Dad used to call the family foundation. Contracts, personal letters, early payroll records, and beneath it all, a thick envelope sealed, once then torn open, its edges jagged like someone had pried it apart in a hurry. Mom slid it toward me. "This," she said softly, "is your father's original will." My hands went cold. The envelope felt heavy, heavier than paper should. When I pulled out the pages, I saw Dad's unmistakable handwriting across the first sheet, strong, confident pen strokes before age began to soften them. He dated it the year Bryce graduated college, the year Tessa launched her design blog, the year I quietly walked across the stage at Bend Community College because Dad had insisted a finance degree wouldn't be useful around here. I scanned the contents, distribution of assets plans for the company, notes about long-term leadership. But something was wrong. There was a missing page. The numbering jumped from 3 to 5. Page 4 had been ripped out, the fibers frayed, torn violently rather than cut. Whoever took it didn't want it found. My throat tightened. "Where's the missing page?" Mom closed her eyes for a long moment. "Hannah." I didn't want to believe it either. A faint stain marked the jagged edge of the torn section, pale pink, blurred, smudged. Lipstick. Not Mom's shade, not mine. Tessa's signature coral gloss. My stomach sank. Mom lowered herself into the chair, opposite me, folding her hands in her lap like she was bracing for impact. "When your father mentioned reworking the will years ago, he said he wanted to include something for you. Something significant. He felt guilty. He knew he'd never given you a fair chance." I blinked hard. "What did he want to give me?" "The same opportunity he gave Bryce," she said gently. "A stake in the company. A voice. A future here." My breath caught. For the first time, Dad had tried to give me a piece of the world I'd spent my entire life trying to earn. And someone had taken it. "Mom, did Dad know the page went missing?" "No," she whispered. "And by the time I found out, he'd convinced himself Bryce could handle everything. He would have blamed himself, not the child he favored." I swallowed the bitterness rising in my throat. "Why didn't you tell him?" Mom's eyes filled. "Because he wouldn't have believed me. And by the time I considered telling him again, it felt too late. The damage was done. My pulse hammered behind my sternum. Years of being dismissed, overlooked, spoken over. It wasn't just neglect. It had been manufactured, forced, erased on purpose. Tessa. Her voice echoed in my memory, sharp, defensive, always claiming things as hers, even before she held them. "If Dad gives her anything, I'll lose everything." I never realized she meant it literally. Mom reached across the desk and placed her hand over mine. I kept this box because I knew one day the truth would matter. I didn't know how or when, but I knew it would come. And tonight, it did. I held the damaged will between my fingers, feeling the weight of everything stolen from me. Everything I never even knew was meant to be mine. But the betrayal didn't sting as sharply as I expected. What hurt wasn't that Tessa had torn the page. It was that Dad had never bothered to wonder why I'd vanished from the family narrative in the first place. "Mom," I whispered, "the company is falling apart. Bryce destroyed supply chains. Tessa bled the budget dry. Dad turned a blind eye. And the people who've been here for decades are the ones paying for it." "I know," she said, voice breaking. "And your father will be heartbroken when he finally sees the truth." A quiet fury flickered inside me, not anger toward Mom or even toward Dad, but toward the pattern that had shaped all of us for too long. Favoritism, denial, comforting lies. "This can't continue," I said. Mom nodded. "I agree." I closed the box, gently feeling the grooves of the old wood under my palms. "Mercer Millworks isn't dead yet," I said. "But it won't survive another year unless someone takes control, and not the kind of control that's passed down like a holiday tradition." Mom's eyes softened. "You mean you?" "I mean someone who knows how to rebuild. Someone who's not afraid to face the mess." I held her gaze. "Someone who already started." A tear slipped down Mom's cheek. "I always knew you'd come back when the time was right." I didn't trust myself to speak, so I stood lifting the box under my arm. The weight felt different now, like history, like truth, like responsibility. At the door, Mom touched my shoulder. "Whatever happens tonight," she whispered, "remember one thing: your place in this family was never meant to be small." The words struck deep, so deep they shook something loose inside me. I stepped into the hallway, each breath steadying the old floorboards creaking beneath my feet. The house smelled like cinnamon and pine and 1,000 Christmases where I'd sat quietly watching everyone else be chosen. But not tonight. Tonight I wasn't the quiet daughter. I wasn't the forgotten sister. I wasn't the girl standing outside closed doors. I was the woman returning with the truth and the leverage to change everything. And as I walked back toward the dining room, carrying the wooden box that held the evidence of who I was, always meant to be, one thing became clear. If I didn't draw the line tonight, this family's legacy would crumble long before the sun outside melted. Bryce's glare cut into me the moment I stepped back into the dining room, the wooden box tucked firmly under my arm. The hum of soft Christmas music played from the speaker near the fireplace, but it suddenly felt out of place, too cheerful for the tension gathering like a storm cloud in the room. He leaned forward, arms crossed, jaw tight. "What did Mom show you?" he demanded. I took my seat slowly, letting the silence stretch, sipping the last of my wine, as though I hadn't just uncovered the truth about a shredded will. "Things you should have cared about," I said calmly, "but didn't." Tessa's voice trembled, the fragile edge of panic barely hidden. "She's hiding something, Greg. She came here with a plan. She's trying to ruin everything." Dad's eyes flickered between the three of us, utterly lost. For decades, he'd controlled every conversation at this table. Tonight, he wasn't even steering his own breath. I rested the box on the table beside my plate. That alone was enough to shift the air, enough to silence Bryce mid-breath. "I'm not hiding anything," I said. "I'm just finally ready to speak." Dad cleared his throat. Let's all calm down. It's Christmas, for heaven's sake." I met his eyes. "Then let's honor it with something we've never had at this table, the truth." He stiffened but didn't disagree. "That was something," Bryce scoffed. "Truth. You've been gone for years. You don't know anything about this family anymore." "You're right," I said, "but I know everything about the company you've been destroying." The room froze. Dad blinked. "What do you mean destroying?" I leaned forward. "Dad, Mercer Millworks will run out of cash in 3 months." The clatter of silverware hitting porcelain made everyone jump. It was Tessa's fork. Dad shook his head. "No, that's impossible. We've had rough patches, yes, But Dad, I interrupted, you haven't been looking closely. The numbers don't lie. Bryce's decisions do. Bryce shot up from his chair. You show up once a year for dinner and think you get to judge me. No, I said evenly. I judged the contracts you signed. I judged the supply chain you collapsed. I judged the safety violations you ignored and the invoices you hid. His face turned crimson. You're lying. I have receipts. Mom gasped softly. Tessa's hand flew to her chest. Dad's breath staggered. You think you're better than me, Bryce snarled. You left Hannah. You abandoned us. I abandoned nothing, I said. I was pushed. That shut him up. Tessa jumped in, her voice sharp with fear. So what, you think you can come in here and take over? Dad always said Bryce would inherit the business. I turned fully toward her. Is that before or after you tore out the page that mentioned me in his will? Her face drained of color, her lips parting in a silent gasp. Dad's eyes widened. What page? Tessa shook her head too quickly. I didn't, Dad, she's making things up. Mom's voice, barely more than a whisper, cut through her panic. Tessa, don't. And that was the moment my sister broke. She sank back into her chair, face blotchy mascara smudging beneath her eyes. Bryce glared at her. What did you do? Tessa's voice cracked. I thought, if Dad gave her anything, I'd lose everything. Dad pressed his palm to his forehead, devastated. Mom looked like she might crumble beside him. I didn't feel triumphant. I felt tired of being erased, tired of watching this family protect lies behind red ribbons and Christmas wreaths. I'm not here to punish anyone, I said quietly. I'm here because this company, Dad's legacy, is dying, and none of you noticed. Dad's voice trembled. Why didn't anyone tell me? Because you stopped listening, I said. Not to me. Not to your employees. Not even to Mom. He swallowed, hard, eyes shining with something dangerously close to regret. I turned back to Bryce. Do you know how many people quit this year because of your leadership? Do you know how many contracts we lost under your signature? Do you know how many families depend on Mercer Millworks surviving? You think I don't care, he shouted. I didn't flinch. No, I think you care about the wrong things. He opened his mouth but closed it again. He didn't have an answer, not one he could say out loud. Dad finally spoke, voice low and hollow. What has been happening there? I lifted the box lid and pulled out copies of the financial statements, invoices, and supply chain breakdowns I'd had Summit's analysts recreate. Everything I said, sliding them toward him. And it's all worse than you think. He looked down at the numbers in disbelief. His shoulders slumped as he whispered, My God. For a moment, no one spoke. The crackling fire became the only sound in the room, the flames dancing violently against the stone hearth, as though reacting to the tension. Then Tessa whispered, Why did you come back, Hannah? Really? The question wasn't accusatory this time. It was small, fragile, a piece of her that had never learned how to be anything other than fearful. I answered honestly, because someone had to save what's left, and because this family deserves the truth before everything collapses. Dad covered his mouth with his hand, staring at the documents. If this is true, then why did Summit buy Mercer Millworks? I stood slowly. Every head lifted. Because I said summits aren't reached by the people you expect. Dad's brow furrowed in confusion. What does that mean? It means, I said steadily, someone had to make the offer before someone else bought the company for scraps. Bryce's eyes bulged. Are you saying? I'm saying I cut in that if I didn't acquire Mercer Millworks when I did, none of us would be sitting at this table right now. The room inhaled as one. Mom's lips parted. Tessa covered her mouth. Dad stared, chest rising and falling in uneven breaths. Bryce looked like he'd been punched in the gut. And I stood there, calm, steady, certain, finally turning into the woman I'd become when no one was looking. Tonight was the storm, but the reckoning was still ahead. Dad's question hung in the air like smoke thick enough to choke on. If this is all true, Then why did Summit Enterprises buy my company? His voice wasn't angry now. It was small, uncertain. The kind of voice I'd never heard from him. I didn't answer right away. I let the silence sit, let it fill the room the way his certainty used to. The Christmas lights blinked across his face, highlighting the deep lines of a man who had spent a lifetime believing he knew everything. Tonight he knew nothing. I set the wooden box gently on the table. The thud was soft, but it sent a ripple through the room. Bryce stiffened. Tessa curled her fingers into her palms. Mom leaned forward as though bracing for impact. "You want the truth," I said. "Then, we're going to talk about everything you refuse to see." Dad swallowed. "Start talking." I lifted the torn will first and let it rest in front of him. His eyes widened at the missing page, the ripped edges, the faded lipstick stain. "This," I said, "is what your daughter considered her inheritance, tearing my piece out, so it looked like I never existed." Tessa gasped, then crumpled as if her spine had melted. I didn't mean." Dad's voice cracked like a dry branch. "You tore my will." She covered her mouth and burst into tears. "I was scared. You always chose her when you thought no one noticed. I couldn't lose everything to her. You lost everything," Dad whispered, "because of yourself." Tessa sobbed harder, shoulders shaking. Bryce stared at her betrayal and disbelief twisting his expression. But I didn't let the moment linger. "Dad," I said, "this isn't just about the will. It's about the company. And the truth is, Mercer Millworks was dying long before Summit appeared." Bryce shot up from his chair. "You don't know anything about running a mill." I met his fury with calm. "I know the numbers. And the numbers don't lie." He barked out a laugh. You've never even set foot in the lumber yards." "Actually," I said, sliding a folder across the table, "I walked every inch of them this fall." "Want to see the reports?" Dad flipped it open and the horror in his eyes grew with every page. Quality failures, rejected shipments, supplier complaints, safety violations, photos of warped lumber, screenshots of emails Bryce ignored. "What is this?" he croaked. "The mess your son created while you trusted him with your legacy." Bryce's face flushed deep red. "You think you're better than me." "No," I said. "I think I'm honest about what I'm capable of." "Something you've never done." Mom inhaled sharply. Even she hadn't expected me to say it out loud. "You're attacking me because you're jealous," Bryce snapped. "Jealous I'm the one Dad chose. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't need to." "Dad didn't choose you. He settled for you." The room went silent except for the crackling fire. "You were never ready," I said softly. "You treated the company like a safety net, not a responsibility. You signed contracts you didn't understand. You cut corners. You gambled with employees' jobs." "Stop it," he growled. "I will," I said, "when you take responsibility." His jaw tightened, but he had no words. Tessa cleared her throat, voice hoarse. "This is too much. Hannah, why are you doing all this? Why come back now?" My eyes softened, but my answer didn't. Because someone had to tell the truth before this family went down with its own delusions. Dad bristled. "Delusions?" I leaned forward. "You wanted Bryce to be your successor so badly that you blinded yourself to who he actually is. And you doubted me so deeply that you never saw who I became." He opened his mouth, then closed it again. "Mom," whispered Greg. "Listen to her," I continued. "You think Summit Enterprises bought Mercer Millworks because it saw potential? No. It bought the company because it saw an emergency." Dad stiffened. "Emergency." "Dad," I said gently, "Mercer Millworks was 3 months from bankruptcy." The shock on his face was painful to witness. His shoulders fell. His breath shook. For a moment he wasn't the founder or the patriarch. He was just a man realizing his life's work had been crumbling beneath him. "How?" he whispered. "Look at the financials I left on your plate," I said. He flipped pages, face pale. "These numbers, these losses. Why didn't Bryce tell me?" I didn't soften my tone. "Because he didn't know how to fix it. And he was too proud to admit it." Bryce stood frozen, anger gone, replaced by something far more human: failure. Dad rubbed his eyes. I thought you were happy in Seattle. I thought you'd moved on. I did, I said quietly, but I never moved away from who I was. Then I placed the final folder on the table, sliding it toward him with slow, steady purpose. What's that? He asked. The purchase agreement, I said. He reached for it cautiously, as if touching something fragile. His eyes scanned the front page. Then he froze. Authorized signatory, he read aloud, voice barely a whisper. Hannah Mercer. Bryce gasped. Tessa clapped a trembling hand over her mouth. Mom closed her eyes as though bracing for the impact she knew was coming. Dad blinked slowly, disbelief turning to realization. You bought my company. His voice cracked on the last word. I met his gaze, not defiant, not triumphant, just steady. I did, I said. Tessa shook her head. No, that can't be real. It's real, I said gently. Every page, every signature. Dad pressed his fingertips to the contract like it was burning his skin. But why? A single tear slipped down Mom's cheek. I took a breath that felt like it carried 8 years of silence. Because if I didn't buy Mercer Millworks when I did, there wouldn't have been a company left for any of us to sit here and fight over tonight. No one spoke. Dad's voice trembled. You saved us, I saved the company, I said. Whether it saves us, that depends on what we do next. The fire crackled again, and the tension in the room shifted, not dissolving but transforming. This wasn't the end. This was the unraveling before the truth. And the truth was only just beginning. The room didn't move. Not a breath, not a twitch, not even the fire dared to crackle after the words left my mouth. I bought Mercer Millworks. For a moment, it felt like the earth itself had paused in disbelief, holding still to witness what my family refused to believe for years, that the daughter they dismissed had quietly built an empire strong enough to buy the legacy they'd taken for granted. Dad clutched the contract as if it were a foreign object. Bryce stared at me like he was trying to see through my skin, searching for the sister he used to talk over at dinner. Tessa's mascara-stained eyes blinked rapidly, as though she could blink the truth away. And Mom. She watched me with something that looked heartbreakingly like pride. It doesn't make sense, Dad whispered finally. You run Summit Enterprises. I don't run it, I said. I built it. From nothing. Bryce barked out a laugh. You did not build a multi-million-dollar firm. Stop pretending you're something you're not. I didn't look at him. I didn't need to. I opened the folder in front of him and laid out the portfolio summaries of Summit's acquisitions. 12 companies, hundreds of employees, contracts spanning Washington, Oregon, Montana, and Idaho. Cascade Furnishings, Dad muttered, recognizing the first name. They were collapsing 5 years ago. They're profitable now, I said. Columbia Steelworks, he continued, his voice cracking. That was one of the biggest regional deals that year. That was ours, I confirmed. Tessa leaned back like her chair might give out. No, you're lying. Then read, I said simply. Dad's eyes moved down the list, growing wider with every line. I watched something shift in him, a slow, painful unwinding of assumptions so old they had become part of his bones. How long have you been doing this? He whispered. 4 years since Summit was founded, I said. 8 since I left Bend. Bryce's face contorted with disbelief. But you don't have a business degree. No, I said calmly. I have grit. And numbers don't care what degree hangs on your wall. His frustration grew desperate. That doesn't make sense. Where did you get the money? Who funded you? Who told you how to do any of this? I finally met his eyes. I learned from the best. People who actually valued me. People who saw what none of you ever bothered to look for. Mom choked back a soft sob. Dad pressed a trembling hand to the table. Hannah, why didn't you ever tell us? I steadied my breath. Because if I'd told you 8 years ago that I wanted to build a private equity firm focused on construction and manufacturing, you would have laughed. Or worse, you would have tried to take control of it. Dad's mouth tightened, memories flickering behind his eyes. Memories of every time he'd told me to stay quiet, to stay small, to leave business to the real Mercers. Tessa spoke next, voice barely audible. So, all this time, you were becoming someone powerful, I nodded once. I wasn't hiding. I was building. She whimpered like she'd been struck. But Dad always said you were too quiet, too soft, not a leader. I turned to her. Dad was wrong. The fire cracked sharply as if agreeing. Tessa buried her face in her hands. Bryce glared at me, rage and humiliation colliding in his expression. You could have told us, he snapped. You could have warned us. You never listened, I said. You never wanted to. I reached into my bag and pulled out the due diligence binder, thick, heavy, full of every detail Bryce never noticed. I placed it in front of Dad. This is why Summit made the offer, I said. Mercer Millworks was failing. Fast. And if Summit hadn't stepped in, someone else would have bought the company for scraps. Dad flipped through page after page, his hands shaking. Cash flow projections, liability summaries, supplier complaints, employee exit reports. This, he said weakly, this is worse than I imagined. It was worse than that, I replied. You didn't see half of what Bryce and Tessa were doing behind your back. Bryce sprang up again. You're twisting things. I was trying to modernize the supply chain. You were cutting corners, I said. And people lost their jobs because of you. He looked at Dad desperately. Tell her she's wrong, but Dad didn't speak. He was staring at something else, the signature page of the purchase agreement. Authorized signatory, he read aloud, barely breathing. Hannah Mercer. The room collapsed into silence again. Tessa wiped her cheeks. So all this time? You were the one buying us out. I didn't buy you out, I said. I bought us time, Dad whispered. Hannah, you saved the company. I gave it a chance. I corrected. But what happens next is up to all of us. Mom stood slowly, walked around the table, and placed her hand on my shoulder, gentle, steady, full of the kind of support I'd spent my entire life pretending I didn't need. You may not have been chosen, she said softly, but you became the only one who could choose us. The words pierced the room like a revelation. Bryce sank into his chair, defeated. Tessa stared at the table, tears clinging to her lashes. Dad looked at me with a mixture of awe and grief. Grief for the decades he'd wasted underestimating the wrong child. Finally, he asked, what happens now? I took a slow breath. Now, I said, we rebuild Mercer Millworks the right way. The flames in the fireplace flickered, brighter shadows dancing on the wall like the start of something new, something none of them saw coming. And I realized this wasn't the moment they learned I owned Summit Enterprises. This was the moment they understood what that truly meant. The future was mine to shape. And the reckoning wasn't over yet. Dad's fingertips trembled on the edge of the expansion plan, as if the paper itself might burn him. The dining room, once loud with accusations and brittle pride, fell into a charged quiet. The only sound was the faint whistle of wind slipping through the old window frames. Everyone stared at the thick binder I'd placed at the center of the table, the blueprint for what Mercer Millworks could become if we had the courage to face what it was now. Bryce scoffed first, though his voice cracked halfway through. Dad, you're not actually considering her plan, are you? She left. She doesn't know anything about how things work here anymore. I turned a page slowly, letting the sound of it slice through his denial. I don't know how things work, I said. Bryce, I know exactly how things work. I spent 2 years studying every contract, every supplier, every cost of goods sold. I know this company better now than you ever did while standing in it. His jaw clenched. Tessa looked between us like she was watching two realities collide and couldn't decide which one to fear more. Dad didn't speak yet. His eyes scanned the first page, then the next. And as he read, I saw something unravel inside him, that stubborn certainty he'd always worn like armor. "Start from the beginning," he said quietly. I nodded and pulled the binder closer to me. "Mercer Millworks should have been a regional leader for custom millwork by now," I began. "You built a name people respected. The craftsmanship was unmatched. Customers trusted you. Employees were loyal. That kind of foundation is rare." Dad blinked, slowly absorbing every word. "But legacy doesn't pass itself on," I continued. "And leadership isn't inherited like an old flannel shirt. It's earned. And in the last decade, Mercer Millworks lost its footing not because the market changed, but because the company stopped growing." Bryce muttered. "We were modernizing." "No," I said sharply. "You were cutting." I opened to the next section, laying out graphs and spreadsheets. Here's what the company needed: a second production facility for overflow capacity, a sustainable supply chain, upgraded machinery, a dedicated commercial development team. Dad frowned. "That sounds like something a corporation, not a family business, would need." "This is exactly why Summit bought Mercer," I said, "to keep it from dying." He rubbed his temples. "Show me the rest." So I did. I flipped to the regional map. Yellow highlights marked opportunity zones across Idaho, Montana, and southern Washington. "These regions are booming," I said. "Construction up, commercial contracts up, demand up." But Mercer Millworks stayed in Bend, and hoped tradition would carry it forward. "Tradition doesn't win bids, Dad. Efficiency does." He inhaled slowly the truth, landing with painful clarity. "And that's why you paid full price," Mom murmured. $50 million. "Yes," I said, "because I wanted you and Mom secure for the rest of your lives. No more scraping, no more worrying. You deserved that after 40 years of building something out of nothing." Dad lifted his head. "But if you bought the company, you could have paid less. You could have asked for a deal." "I didn't want a deal," I said firmly. "I wanted to earn it. I wanted Summit to be chosen because it was the best partner, not because I'm your daughter." Silence filled the room, but this time it wasn't heavy. It was reflective. Tessa whispered, "What else does the plan say?" I flipped to the workforce section, the part that meant the most to me. "It says we invest in people," I replied. "Not shortcuts, not vanity projects, not empty promises." I slid forward a page listing the core changes: workforce retention, leadership training, apprenticeship programs for locals who grew up here, better safety protocols, real opportunities for workers to move up. Dad swallowed hard, eyes glistening. He knew what this meant to the employees who'd stood beside him through every storm. Then I turned to Bryce. "And yes," I said firmly, "it includes a place for you, if you want it." He stared at me, caught between hope and humiliation. "What kind of place?" "Project coordinator," I said. "Entry level, the role I started in." His face flushed. "You expect me to start at the bottom. I expect you to start where the real work begins," I replied. "If you want to lead someday, you need to understand every bolt and board first." I had to. You will too. Dad watched him with a gaze I'd never seen, steady, firm, yet hopeful. Tessa cleared her throat. "And me," I turned to her next. "You have design talent," I said honestly, "but not discipline, not structure. If you want to help Mercer, you'll join the commercial development design team and train properly. Learn costs, learn regulations, learn clients." Her lip quivered. "You mean I actually have to work?" "Yes," I said gently. "Because entitlement isn't a job title." Dad let out a breath that sounded almost like relief. Mom wiped a tear discreetly. "This," Dad whispered, tapping the binder, "this could work." "It could actually work." "It will," I said. "If everyone in this room commits to earning their place instead of assuming it." He nodded slowly, an ache crossing his face. "I should have done this years ago. I should have prepared all of you. I should have stayed ahead instead of staying comfortable." "You did what you knew," I said softly. "But now it's time to do better." The room quieted again. Then unexpectedly Bryce spoke, not loudly, not angrily, but with something raw. "What if I can't do it?" he said. What if I'm not like you? I stepped closer, standing directly in front of him. You won't be like me, I said. You'll be like you, and that's enough if you try. His eyes dropped, and for the first time in years he looked like the little boy who once tried to build birdhouses with Dad's leftover scraps. Tessa's voice broke next. Hannah, I don't know if I can change. I've never been strong like you. You don't need to be me, I said. You just need to stop running from who you are. Tessa wiped her cheeks. But what if I fail, then you stand up? I said. That's how growth works. Dad placed his hand on the binder again, his voice thick with emotion. I thought I was building a business for my children, but I didn't realize one of them would build a future for all of us. The words hit me like a soft, unexpected blow. Not painful, but deeply human. I looked around the table at each of them. Bryce with his shaken pride, Tessa with her fragile fear, Dad with his stunned humility, Mom with her quiet strength. This plan, I said, isn't just for the company. It's for us. It's what comes next. Dad nodded, his voice barely steady. Then what do we do now? I closed the binder gently. Tomorrow morning, I said, we start rebuilding Mercer Millworks. But inside, I knew something else. The rebuilding wasn't just business. It was the beginning of who we would all become next. Bryce shot up from his chair so abruptly the salt shaker toppled over. I'm not reporting to my little sister, he snapped, voice shaking like he wasn't sure whether he wanted to shout or cry. Dad, you can't actually agree to this. She's trying to take everything. Dad didn't respond. His eyes were still fixed on the binder, shoulders slumped the way old trees bend after too many storms. And for the first time, Bryce realized there would be no rescue, no fatherly reassurance that he was the chosen one. I stayed seated, hands calmly folded on the table. No one is taking anything from you, I said quietly. You're just being asked to earn what you thought you were entitled to. Bryce pointed at me, finger trembling. This is humiliating. It's accountability, I said. You should try it. Tessa flinched as if the words struck her too. He swung toward Dad. Say something. Tell her she can't do this. Dad finally looked up, and the grief in his eyes nearly hollowed the room. Bryce, she's not wrong. The words shattered him. His face went slack, pride draining like water through cracked stone. So that's it, he whispered. I'm the failure. No, I said softly. You failed, but you're not the failure. There's a difference. He sank back into his chair, chest rising too fast, breath catching. For the first time in his life, he didn't have a comeback, only fear. Tessa's voice came next, thin and brittle. This is too much. We can't just change everything overnight. Dad, you said. Dad cut her off sharply. I never promised you children a throne. Her lips parted in shock. But I spoiled you, he snapped. That's all I did. I let you believe the world would bend for you because this company bent for me. His voice cracked on the last word. Mom reached for his hand, but her eyes were on me. There was no victory in this moment, no satisfaction, only the weight of a family finally seeing its own reflection and not liking what stared back. I drew a slow breath. You both need to understand something. This isn't punishment. This is what growth looks like. Bryce looked up at me, eyes wet but angry. Why are you doing this? Why come back at all? Because Mercer Millworks deserved better than the way you treated it, I said. And because the people depending on us deserve leaders who know what they're doing. He swallowed hard. And I added quietly because Mom asked me to. Every head turned. Tessa blinked. Dad stared at Mom as though seeing her for the first time. Mom squeezed Dad's hand, then spoke with a steady voice that seemed to echo years of silence. I sent Hannah an email last year, anonymous. I told her the company was falling apart and that someone needed to intervene. Dad recoiled. You went behind my back. She held his gaze. Because you wouldn't listen. You were drowning in pride, Greg. And our children were drowning in the consequences of it. It felt like the whole house exhaled. A truth. decades in the making finally spoken. Tessa pressed a shaking hand to her mouth. "Mom, why didn't you tell us? Because you weren't listening either," Mom said gently. Then the room fell quiet again, the kind of quiet that happens right before a family either breaks entirely or begins to rebuild. "Look," I said, drawing their attention back to me, "I'm offering both of you a future inside this company. A real one, but only if you're willing to put in the work." Bryce stared at the table. "And if we're not, then you walk away," I answered. "But you don't get a title. You don't get ownership. And you don't get to keep pretending you've earned something you didn't." He closed his eyes slowly, the truth settling into him like a cold wind. Tessa looked at me next. "And me? What am I supposed to do? I've never had to prove anything." "That's the problem," I said gently, "and it's why this is your chance to grow." She sniffed, wiping her cheeks. What if I mess up again?" "You will," I said without hesitation. "Everyone does. What matters is that you learn instead of hiding behind excuses." Tessa nodded weakly, a small spark of sincerity flickering where entitlement once burned. Dad leaned forward, elbows on the table, voice gravel low. "You're saying this family can be repaired?" I looked at him, not flinching from the decades of hurt that lingered behind his eyes. Families break when no one is willing to tell the truth, but they heal when people choose to grow. He absorbed that slowly, like a man learning to breathe again. "So what happens now?" he asked. "Now," I said, "we each face the consequences of who we have been so we can become who we need to be." Mom nodded in quiet agreement. For a long moment no one spoke. The fire popped, the clock ticked, outside snow began brushing against the windows. Then Bryce whispered, "What do you want me to do?" I met his eyes. There was no arrogance now, no posturing, just a tired young man who'd been raised to believe he deserved a crown he never learned how to wear. "You start at the bottom," I said. "Same as I did." He didn't argue this time. "And me?" Tessa asked with a trembling breath. "You'll train," I said. "Really train. Your designs will be judged by merit, not by family name." Her nod was small but real. Dad leaned back, closing his eyes, his voice raw. "Hannah, I didn't realize how badly I'd failed you." "You didn't fail me," I said quietly. "You underestimated me. That's different. And now we get to fix it." His eyes glistened. "If you'll let me try, I will," I said. "But you need to trust me truly, trust me to lead." His nod was slow, heavy, and full of meaning. Mom squeezed his hand again. "It's time." Outside the snow thickened, blanketing the world in white, a clean slate. Inside something shifted, subtle, fragile, but unmistakably real. A beginning, not of forgiveness, not of forgetting, but of change. And as I looked around the table at Bryce's shaken humility, Tessa's quiet resolve, Dad's bowed head, Mom's steady strength, I knew this was the moment everything would pivot. "They thought the revelation ended tonight," I murmured to myself. But the real work and the real healing was just beginning. Bryce was waiting for me at the mill gate before sunrise, standing under the buzzing street lamp like a man preparing for a verdict. Snow dusted his shoulders, his breath visible in the frigid air. Gone was the expensive jacket, the polished boots, the cocky tilt of his chin. He looked like a boy again, scared, unsure, finally stripped of the armor entitlement had given him his whole life. "I'm here," he said quietly. "If the offer still stands." I studied him for a moment. His eyes held something new, not arrogance, not defiance. Humility. A willingness to start over. "It stands," I said. He nodded, once relieved and terrified all at once. Inside the mill, the fluorescent lights flickered to life, illuminating the concrete floors, the machinery, the dust hanging like a thin veil. This was the same place I'd once been told I'd never belong. Now it felt like mine in a different way, not possession, but purpose. I led Bryce to operations where a gruff supervisor named Phil waited. Phil had been with Mercer Millworks longer than any of us had been alive. He eyed Bryce with the skepticism of someone who'd seen too many promises and not enough effort. "This your brother Phil?" asked. "Yes," I said. "He'll be starting as project coordinator." Phil let out a single humorless laugh. "Coordinator. Fancy word for apprentice." Bryce swallowed. "I understand." "Do you?" Phil said. "We'll see." I watched the two shake hands, Bryce's grip hesitant, Phil's firm. For the first time, Bryce didn't flinch at being treated like a newcomer. Small victories mattered. I left them to it and walked to the new design office we'd set up in the old conference room. Tessa was there already, sitting at a drafting table, with a steaming mug of coffee she clearly hadn't touched. Her hands were clasped tightly in her lap, knuckles white. "I don't know where to start," she admitted the moment she saw me. "That's fine," I said. "Starting is the important part." She nodded, then opened her sketch pad. Her first design was beautiful. Elegant lines, rich colors, completely impractical for commercial development. "This is lovely," I said honestly. "But it won't pass code." Her face fell. "I thought so." "Let's fix it," I said, pulling a chair beside hers. We spent the next hour going over building codes, safety standards, functional layouts, things she'd never been taught because no one ever expected her to learn. She listened, took notes, asked questions. Earnest, trying, growing. Sometimes redemption whispers before it roars. Walking back through the mill, I saw familiar faces, workers I'd grown up around, men and women who'd watched me build treehouses and skin my knee on lumber scraps. When they realized I was the one who bought the company, their shock had turned into something else. "Hope, good to have you back," Hannah one said. "You're gonna save this place," another murmured. "He didn't make promises." I just nodded, letting their faith settle into me like warmth. By afternoon, Summit's consultants arrived, engineers, auditors, supply chain specialists. They walked through the plant with me, taking notes, asking sharp questions, examining equipment Bryce had ignored. There were solutions, real ones. But they would require uncomfortable truths, long hours, and more humility than this family had ever exercised. And then the test came. A call from Idaho. The supplier we needed for a major commercial project was pulling out due to unpaid invoices from Bryce's tenure. If we didn't fix it, we'd lose a contract worth millions. I walked fast toward operations, where Bryce stood reviewing safety guidelines with Phil. "Bryce," I said, "we have a problem. Idaho's supplier is threatening to pull." Phil cursed under his breath. Bryce froze, panic rising in his eyes. "What do we do?" "What do you do?" I corrected. "You make the call. You negotiate." He stared at me. I don't know how." "You learn," I said. "Right now." Phil handed him the phone. "Sink or swim, kid." Bryce's hand shook as he dialed, but he forced the words out. His first attempt failed. The supplier was angry, rightfully so. He looked at me helplessly. I crossed my arms. "Try again. Own the mistake. Fix it." He took a breath, steadied his tone, apologized without excuses, and proposed a revised payment schedule with improved terms on future orders. This time the supplier softened. By the end of the call, the relationship was salvaged. When Bryce hung up, he looked at me almost shyly. "Did I do okay?" "You did the job," I said. "That's more than you've done in years." Something fragile and real flickered across his face. Later that week, Tessa had her own test. A hospital renovation in Montana needed a redesign, fast, efficient, and compliant. She stayed up late, drawing, redrawing, rethinking every detail. When she handed me the final draft, her hands shook. "Be honest," she whispered. "I studied the plans. Clean, functional, thoughtful. You passed," I said. Tessa let out a breath that turned into a shaky laugh. "I didn't think I could." "That's because no one ever asked you to," I said. "You're stronger than you've acted." Her eyes filled, but she blinked the tears away. "Healing looks different on everyone." A week later, we had the first family dinner since Christmas. No shouting. No hidden agendas. Just quiet conversation over chicken and roasted vegetables. Mom kept staring at us like she was afraid the moment would vanish if she blinked too long. Midway through dinner, Bryce cleared his throat. "Hannah." I looked up. "I was wrong," he said simply. "About everything. It wasn't dramatic. It wasn't rehearsed. It was the truth finally spoken." Tessa added, "I don't want to compete anymore. I want to contribute." Dad lifted his glass not as a patriarch demanding respect, but as a man humbled by the children he'd misjudged. "To the new Mercer Millworks," he said, "and to the woman who saved us, I didn't toast to myself. I toasted to all of us, broken, flawed, but finally willing to grow." The next afternoon, as I left the mill, the air crisp and bright with winter sun, I paused beneath the new sign we'd installed. Mercer Millworks, a Summit Enterprises flagship. It felt right, honest, full circle. My phone buzzed in my pocket. A message from Warren, my mentor in Seattle. "Call me." A new offer just landed, a large one, big enough to change everything again. I stared at the screen as a slow smile formed. I had rebuilt my family. Now it was time to decide what I wanted for myself, and for the first time in my life, that choice was entirely mine. Snow drifted lazily outside the dining room window, settling over the yard in soft white layers that made everything look cleaner, calmer, newer. A year had passed since the Christmas that broke us open, and now the house hummed with a warmth I hadn't felt since childhood. Laughter flowed lightly between rooms, the fireplace glowed with steady confidence, and for once the air didn't feel like a minefield waiting to explode under a wrong word. When I stepped into the room, everyone looked up, not with suspicion, not with resentment, but with genuine welcome. Bryce stood first. "Hey," he said, offering a small, earnest smile. "We were waiting for you." Tessa scooted a chair out for me, her eyes bright, in a way I didn't recognize from the girl she'd been a year ago. "Sit next to me. I want to show you something later." Dad rose slowly, his movements careful but strong, and when he kissed my forehead there was no hesitation. "Merry Christmas, sweetheart." The word sweetheart didn't sting this time. It felt earned, not because I'd needed his approval, but because we'd finally learned how to meet one another without the weight of old expectations. As we all settled around the table, Mom emerged from the kitchen carrying a tray of gingerbread cookies shaped like little tools, tiny hammers, saws, and planks. She set them down laughing. "Your father said it would be symbolic." Dad grinned sheepishly. "We're a Millworks family. We build things, and rebuild them," I added. His smile softened. "And rebuild." The meal was simple and peaceful. No shouting, no slammed forks, no bitterness. Just the easy comfort of a family learning how to exist without tearing itself apart. The new version of Mercer holidays tasted like roasted squash, warm bread, and second chances. After dinner, Bryce tapped his fork on his glass. "Okay, I need to say this before I lose my nerve." We all turned toward him. He swallowed hard. "Last year I acted like the company was owed to me. Like leadership was my birthright just because I was the oldest son. I was wrong." His voice steadied. "I thought starting from the bottom would humiliate me. But it turns out, it saved me. It gave me purpose. Real purpose." He glanced at me, gratitude shining through. "Thanks, Hannah, for giving me a chance I didn't deserve." I felt my heart swell heavy and full. "You earned the second one," I said. "Not me." Next to him, Tessa dabbed her eyes. "My turn," she sniffled. "I didn't just tear a page out of Dad's will. I spent years tearing holes in this family and pretending they weren't there. I wanted things to look perfect from the outside because I felt so insecure on the inside." She reached for my hand. "You were the strong one all along. And I'm learning. Strength isn't about being loud. It's about being responsible. Thank you for showing me that." I squeezed her fingers gently. "You rebuilt yourself, Tess." I just pointed at the blueprint. Mom sighed in that way mothers do when they're proud, relieved, and emotional all at once. Dad rested his hand over hers, their fingers intertwined, like they'd rediscovered the rhythm of partnership. When the plates had been cleared and the tree lights dimmed to a soft glow, Dad fumbled in his pocket. I have something for you, Hannah." He handed me a small wooden box. Not the same old founder's box. This one was new, carved by hand, the grains still crisp and raw. "Open it," he urged. Inside was a small wooden gavel, polished, beautifully weighted. "The old one I used was too worn," he said with a faint smile. "This one is yours. For meetings, for decisions, for the future." Emotion climbed my throat, warm and overwhelming. "Dad, you're the leader Mercer Millworks needed," he said simply. "And the daughter I should have seen a long time ago." For once I didn't need to hide my tears. After the gifts were opened and the night settled into that soft, fading calm unique to winter holidays, I stepped outside for a breath of cold air. Snowflakes twirled downward like tiny, weightless reminders that the world keeps moving even when we feel stuck. My phone buzzed Warren again. "We need to discuss the offer," his message read. "It's a big one. Big enough to put Summit on the national map. Call me when you're ready." I slipped the phone back into my coat pocket and looked up at the sky, the stars barely visible behind drifting clouds. For the first time in my life, the future didn't feel like a door someone else kept closed. It felt like a wide-open road waiting for me to choose the direction. Behind me, laughter floated through the window. My family changed, but still ours. I thought about the girl I used to be. The quiet daughter. The overlooked one. The invisible piece of a legacy I thought didn't want me. And I realized something. I didn't rebuild Mercer Millworks because they finally saw me. I rebuilt it because I finally saw myself. And that was the real miracle. If you've ever fought to prove your worth, if you've ever been underestimated by the people meant to love you most, then you already understand the heart of this story. Tell me in the comments. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself in a way that changed everything? If Hannah's journey resonated with you, tap the like button so more people can find stories like this. And if you want to hear more tales of strength, healing, and justice, make sure you subscribe so you don't miss the next chapter. After all, every family has a story. And sometimes the quietest voice becomes the one everyone finally hears.